Hi there, it's Friday, March 20th, 2020, and what I thought I'd do today, seeing as we're all going to be spending quite a bit more time at home with lots of spare time on our hands, I thought I would do a short review of a number of dystopian novels which I've enjoyed over the years, which kind of, I think quite fitting in a morbid sort of way for the situation that we're sort of facing today. I'm not going to talk about sort of the big classics, 1984, Brave New World, The Stand by Stephen King, things like that. And one thing I would say, that if you are a parent and you haven't watched The Road yet, don't. Just don't bother watching it. Anyway, so just quickly rattle through a few books, a few of my favourites. So if you're in the UK, you should start with John Christopher's The Death of Grass. Okay, this is a great novel. It's really down to earth and gritty. So it's like a sort of gritty drama, as opposed to a polished Hollywood production or some giant epic like 1984 or Brave New World or something like that. And this relates to a virus from China. But this is a virus that affects all grass species, hence the death of grass. So it affects wheat, rice production, and so the back premise is food shortage. I'm just going to read a tiny little bit. This is the statement for the President of the United States, and this is during part of the story, obviously. He said, "It is to be expected that this country will mourn the loss to barbarism of Europe, the cradle of Western civilization. We cannot help being grieved and shocked by what is taking place on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. At the same time, this does not mean that there is the slightest danger of a similar catastrophe occurring here. Our food stocks are high, and though it is probable that rations will have to be reduced in the coming months, there will be ample food for all. In the fullness of time, we shall defeat the Chungli virus and go out to reclaim the wide world we once knew. Until then, our duty is to preserve within the limits of our own nation the heritage of man's greatness." So that's John Christopher, Death of Grass. If you're in the UK and you're watching this and you've not read any dystopian literature, start with this one. If you're in America, I would start with George R. Stewart, The Earth Abides. And this deals with a disease, a human disease pandemic, and with very low survivability. And I'll just read a little bit of that. So the story starts with the guy he's been bit by a snake, and he's in isolation, and he survives the initial sort of onset of the virus through the population, and then comes out of his illness to rejoin society and finds there's nothing left. The headlines told him what was most essential. The United States from coast to coast was overwhelmed by the attack of some new and unknown disease of unparalleled rapidity of spread and fatality. Estimates for various cities, admittedly little more than guesses, indicated that between 25 and 35% of the population had already died. No reports, he read, were available for Boston, Atlanta and New Orleans, indicating that the news services in those cities had already broken down. Rapidly scanning the rest of the paper, he gained a variety of impressions, a hodgepodge which he could scarcely put together in any logical order. In its symptoms, the disease was like a kind of super measles. No one was sure in what part of the world it had originated. Aided by aeroplane travel, it had sprung up almost simultaneously in every centre of civilization, outrunning all attempts at quarantine. Fairly prescient, as most dystopian literature is. That's why I enjoy it so much. So moving rapidly ahead, a good place to begin if you want a short read, or maybe for sort of younger people to get a kind of an idea of it. And again, amazingly written, I believe sometime in maybe 1920, maybe earlier. Ian Forster, The Machine Stops. This edition here, the Modern Classic Fiction edition, also has a second very short story in the back, which is also excellent. But this is it's very much in the realm of sort of Brave New World in terms it's a dystopian future view, but reading this and seeing the rise of social media and how that works in terms of isolating people for, and that's absolutely classic and striking when you read that and you look at the way the world is prior to this virus. In the same vein of future dystopias, Zamyatin's We, which is probably quite difficult to read, is excellent. It's a slightly more challenging read in terms it's translated, and the pace and the feel of the book are quite different than one that's been written natively in English. And sometimes it's I find it a little difficult to sort of visually grasp, let's say, what was going on. But again, that's definitely worth a read. It's a very, very different viewpoint of sort of future culture, society, societal control, and attempts to break from control mechanisms of totalitarian society. So no more comments about that. We're gonna blend a little bit more. Well, I wouldn't say this is science fiction actually, although it's classed within science fiction. Doris Lessing's Shikasta. This is written in the 70s, and this is one of my favourite books of all time. And as opposed to being a dystopian view of the future, it actually starts in deep antiquity with the concept of the fall of consciousness of humanity into our present state, and the story projects through now maybe 10, 20 years into the future from where we are now. When it's written in the 70s, it would have been 50, 60 years into the future. Again, with societal changes, predominance of the Chinese Communist Party in the world in the end. And although it's very bleak in places, and its view of humanity is very critical of human philosophy, morality, society, and rightly so, and excellently written, ultimately it kind of ends on an uptick, which, it's a very, very different book, and one of my all-time favourites, out of any genre. So yeah, Doris Lessing's Shikasta, part of a series of books, but this is the most accessible, let's say. The others are a little bit more challenging. Let's go into a little bit more science fiction, and this is a trilogy of which I have two parts. The first part, called The Three-Body Problem, is out on loan. You know who you are. And the author's name is Liu Cixin, I think, Chinese author. So the first in the trilogy is The Three-Body Problem, then you have The Dark Forest, then you have Death's End. If you like sci-fi, well, this goes from the Chinese Cultural Revolution and then through present times to way, 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 way in the future. But again, there's a lot of sort of philosophy and morality, how we organise ourselves as a species, how we cope with existential and external threats, and I just devoured these. So if you're into sort of your deep science fiction, if you're not into science fiction, don't be put off by the genre. Certainly the first and second books are much more sort of historical and present day. And very digestible in that way. You don't have to have a science fiction head. But if you're into sort of the deep science fiction, then the second part of the second book into the third book, it's interesting. You'll enjoy that. So the next thing I'd like to look at is a little bit more science fiction. Two Arthur C. Clarke titles, and the first one, The City and the Stars. I first read this as a kind of I wouldn't say lonely teenager, but as a teenager, and as a lot of teenagers did, I sort of felt a little bit different, a little bit out on a limb, a little bit isolated, maybe emotionally and whatever else. It makes it sound terrible. It wasn't really terrible, but anyway, it really appealed. So I think for teens, something like this would be a good place to start. It's not strictly dystopian. There are dystopian, utopian blends really with it, but it's I think it's a good place to start. Again, if someone maybe 13, 14, 15 is kind of looking for something a bit more challenging, Arthur C. Clarke's City and the Stars is very good. And then finally, Also by Arthur C. Clarke, Childhood's End. Again, this is kind of, from utopia to a very different ending. Again, like all Arthur C. Clarke, it's it's an excellent book. And I just finished, this is just the very beginning of chapter 19, and it kind of jumped out, because again it's pressing with what's going on at the moment. There came a time when the world of Geoffrey's dreams was no longer sharply divided from his everyday existence. He no longer went to school, and for Jean and George, also the routine of daily life was completely broken, as it was soon to break down throughout the world. They avoided all their friends, as if already conscious that soon no one would have sympathy to spare for them. Sometimes in the quietness of night, when there were few people about, they would go for long walks together. They were closer now than they had been since the first days of their marriage, united again in the face of the still unknown tragedy that would soon overwhelm them. Anyway, so I hope you enjoyed that sort of mini flyover of a few of my favourite dystopian novels. So I'll leave a link, a list of those in the description box below. And any questions or comments, of course, would be most gratefully received. All right, take care out there.